So today we're thinking about the application of Aristotle's theory, and some of the people who followed Aristotle: Aquinas, Anscombe, Foote, McIntyre, and how they might be applied to some issues. We see some pictures of issues: environment, equality, sexual ethics, war and pacifism, euthanasia. Okay, let's see how you've done, Ben. So how did Aristotle view the soul? Divided in three. Very good. Yeah, the passions and two other bits. So there were several of these trichotomist views of the soul around. It was a common idea. Plato had a trichotomist view, as did Aristotle. I had to go anything else. What does Aristotle mean when he writes that the good person is the good for humans is being happy? You said the good for humans is self-sufficient. Well, let's have a quick look at some of the answers, and I'll put them up on the screen. So on that question on the tripartite split between, you mentioned the passions, so that's the sort of bodily appetites not involved in morality, but nothing wrong with those. The faculties and the traits, so the virtues, the faculties and the traits. So the faculties are like skills, and the traits he thinks are something higher still. And in response to that question, what did Aristotle mean when he writes that the good man is self-sufficient? So he's talking about the good is to be desired for its own sake. The good involves this teleological system that involves actions, actions that are ordered towards a purpose, developing in a certain way as a person. And the final good, the ultimate good, there are many small goods, but the ultimate good is the good in itself, which is eudaimonia, which we got to. Cracking stuff. Okay, who's joined us? Some other people have joined us. Joshua, good to have you, Josh. Right. He's typing. Fantastic. Hi, Josh. Right. So today we're going to introduce or finish off virtue ethics. And we're going to think, now this lesson isn't, specifically on the syllabus. I'm going to show you this in a second. We want to think of why am I doing this with so much to do? And I've got a reason for it. So we want to think about the application of virtue ethics to particular issues. We've got pictures here of environmental ethics, equality, sexual ethics, war, euthanasia. These are all things, apart from euthanasia, you've done this year. Euthanasia is something that comes up next year. So these are all key applied ethics areas. So contemporary applications of virtue theory, well, that could be kind of Philip Foote and McIntyre in that sense. But it also talks about relevant assessment of relevant examples. So appropriateness of their continuing application and use, assessment of relevant examples. Changes in the law and social attitudes vis-a-vis the theory. Okay, so that's kind of what we're covering today. I have one more go at this Per Deck app that I'm trying. Can you type anything in? Can you type a response on the screen? What happens if you hover your cursor, anything at all? Maybe not. We may have to use the chat function. Anything your mic's not working, Josh. I see that. Can you type on the screen? In theory, if you type, I should see it, but no. Not seeing anything. Audience Q&A. Hold on, starting. No, I don't even know what that is. Ask a question. Started something new. I haven't done that before. I think we'll have to call it quits and we'll just crack on. So what are we doing today? Well, we want to think about applied ethics. Let me get rid of that thing now. I can't get rid of that. Is that going to be there for? Got to get rid of that now. Notes. Advanced tool off. Right, that's better. Okay, applied ethics in terms of these issues, in particular, how particular scholars would think about these, and there's a range of attitudes, and we can think about some strengths and weaknesses of these scholars' attitudes. Now, why am I asking you to think about the application of virtue ethics to these issues? Well, because when you write essays, I have this repeated phrase, this mantra, that examiners love examples, that you need to critically use, especially in the sort of big essays, 20, the 12 mark, the 20 mark, the 30 mark essay, examples if you're doing ethics. And you need to be able to give an example of how virtue ethics is applied. So in this sort of question, you can think how a range of virtues, remember the different scholars all have their own lists of virtues that reflect their own preoccupations and their own context. How these different, you could choose between the different virtues that are appropriate to different contexts. And it might help you make specific points about what is the theory and its nature, as it were. So when we think about virtue ethics, the reason I want to focus on this, because it's not as straightforward as applying utilitarianism. We saw utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, and we might have thought about applying Bentham's hedonic calculus to all the usual issues. Next year, when we do deontology, Kant's ethical theory, his idea of the categorical imperative, which you haven't done yet, but you will. Again, that's fairly easy, his duty-based, rule-based ethic in terms of application. Virtue ethics is different. Its approach, as we know, is concerned with starting with the question, what sort of person should I be? What would the virtuous person do? A bit like asking, not what would Jesus do, but what would Mr. Kernahan do? Because there you go. If you're in doubt at any time in your life, you just ask, what would Mr. Kernahan do? And then you've got your answer. Now, there's all kinds of shows on television. I was trying to think of illustrations that would illustrate this. There's a drama called The Family Man, in which a fertility doctor is faced with many ethical dilemmas. Should he allow a couple to choose the gender of their IVF baby and abort the other gendered baby, as it were, to replace their son who has died? This is an ambitious doctor, and he makes wrong decisions, perhaps, although he is compassionate. So we got different virtues going on there. He's gullible, he's ambitious. So there are negative virtues, perhaps vices, perhaps cowardice. And yet at the same time, he has compassion is not one of Aristotle's virtues, but it is a revealed virtue. Remember, faith, hope, and compassion are love. So maybe the application of wisdom here was needed. He lacked phronesis, he lacked prudence. So we're not doing IVF. That's not something, but that's typical of how it might be applied. So if we ask the question, and nobody's got a mic, so it's going to be difficult to ask questions, but never mind. And our typing is a bit limited, but we'll come back to that. Why is applying ethics difficult? Important in the exam? Well, examiners love examples. You need your AO1, not knowledge, but knowledge and understanding. Knowledge and understanding to do this. Now, virtue ethics is more difficult to apply in other things. So we need to kind of think, how do we begin this? How do we begin this? Well, we begin this, as we said, with asking what sort of thing a virtuous person would do. And that's the start of virtue ethics. Faced with an ethical or moral or challenge, the question to ask is, what would a virtuous person do in this in this dilemma, and then you know. Right, I was hoping we could type this in, but we'll maybe have to do it on the chat function. Here's environmental ethics, and it would have been easier with a mic. I would have been hoping it would have been easier to do per deck, but oh, that's not working. Type it in. What do you think of virtuous? Anything of virtuous? One thing, a phrase. Type it in the chat if you haven't got a mic. And I'll have some Wensleydale. I've just got a little bit of Wensleydale left. Oh, not to overconsume. There we go. I'm going to overconsume here with my Wensleydale. Oh. Ben, anything to add? What a virtuous person I'm doing in terms of... Okay, if you're making notes, then you want to make some notes in this. You want to have some examples that, and I'm focusing on the applied ethical issues that we've come up in the course, because then that feeds back into and supports kind of revision this. Okay, let's have a look at it then. And we're just going to, I think we're going to go through 4 or 5 issues here and just a couple of slides in each, and you make some notes. So here's environmental ethics. So Aristotle believed in a hierarchy of nature. Remember the idea of the soul. There is a plant type soul that is nutritive, means it just gets food and water and tries to survive. There's an animal type soul that is, so animals are aimed at an element of pleasure, the animal passions, but there is a human soul that is aimed at rationality. So humans are obviously there for the tops because we have this rational self, this intellectual virtue ability. Now, this would suggest, remember in environmental ethics, we talked about deep and shallow ecology. Deep and shallow ecology. And the idea of Marshall's 3 categories. The idea, and this is hurting your brain, I know, because you've got to think back now. There was the libertarian extension of the 3 categories. That means what Singer said, we've got to extend the rights that we give to humans to animals. There was the ecological extension, which was to extend the rights we give to humans to the whole planet. And maybe Gaia theory is an example of that. And then there was this approach, this shallow conservationist approach. We look at, and it's Kantian, we look after the environment because it's, or maybe it's utilitarian, because it in the end will serve us if we do that. So the virtue ethical approach could be a conservationist approach. We look after the environment because it benefits humans, damaging, because of pollution and everything else. Such a world would not be in a state of eudaimonia. Wouldn't be a eudaimonian state. It wouldn't be a place where you could develop virtue. You want a world where you can develop virtue, and a destroyed environment is not one. So again, this is a sort of shallow instrumental approach that many virtue ethicists take to environmental ethics. So the theory would focus on the virtues. Moral virtues are developed by habit. In the same way, we develop good habits by the way we treat the environment. Recycling, walking, cycling, car sharing, conserving energy. All of these practices would develop to different degrees, courage, kindness, temperance, and so on. It would be ways of practicing the golden mean. So it's important to be kind, but you have to be kind to learn to be kindness. And the answer for the environment is to take this sort of middle path, not to use too much energy, not to overindulge, not to consume an excess. I think Josh said it, not to overconsume, but neither to underconsume, I think, is the way you might think about it. Not consuming an excess of food, to live happily and be fulfilled without doing too much damage to the environment. Okay, so that's it, the big broad brushstrokes. I thought I'd just reference one scholar. So that's the overview, and here's the detailed scholarly work, the A grade type stuff. A book on environmental virtue ethics, so that's called EVE, Environmental Virtue Ethics, was written by Venschvin. No surprise, she's Nordish. And what she says in her book about environmental virtue ethics, she actually thinks, well, she says there's more than the conservationist approach. She thinks actually virtue ethics might yield other approaches. So three things that she thinks you can say: that there is a virtue theory approach which attempts to build an environmental virtue ethics from the ground up. So that's just what we've been describing, the shallow virtue ethicist approach. In a middle way, moderate consumption. Second, then, she thinks actually people like Arnold Naas and other deep ecologists, environmentalists, might offer exemplar individuals who would be inspiring and who would be environmentally virtuous as models. So actually she can see a role for deep ecology. The practice of deep ecology is inspirational, an exemplarist theory of virtue ethics here going on. And finally, she can see what she calls an extensionist approach. This is from Marshall's language, which takes traditional virtues and extends them to operate in an environmentally meaningful way. Now, this is the most difficult one. In what ways can the planet be virtuous? Can a lake be virtuous? Can a tree be virtuous? So I struggle to understand this particular one, but she thinks if you can extend them to operate in an environmentally meaningful way. I haven't read the full book, so I'm not quite sure what she means by this. So here we have the full range of approach to the environment, and she thinks virtue ethics can, in both deep and shallow ecology, play a role. So that's virtue ethics and the environment. That's issue number one of, I think, 5 issues. All right, just checking for any questions. You'll have to type them in. Here we go. Ben, is it a virtue to not or underconsume, to restrict ourselves too much, thus making environmentalism too far in either direction not a virtue? A golden mean, yes. Now, in answer to your question, yes, a sort of middle path. That would be the shallow. That would be in what was her name? In the term of Louis van Venschveen. I can't. My language is terrible. That's in her approach. That would be the number one. Ben, but actually, she thinks other environmentalists who would be inspired by Arnold Naas would say that the shallow approach is not enough. You need to be inspired by the exemplar of Arnold Naas and live simply and not just live moderately, but live simply. That's much. Now, others would reply that's a vice to underconsume, as it were. But there you go. That'll be a debate within the EVE community, environmental virtue ethicists, and how they would argue the point. Good. Keep typing your questions in. We'll go on to the next issue. Great question, Ben. Let's go on to the next issue. So, virtue ethics. Okay, let's think about war and pacifism. Hopefully you did a bit on that. I might recover it a little tiny bit next year. We haven't got a lot of time, but we might do a bit. Again, I was hoping you could write on the screen, but it seems you can't. But if you could put it in the chat, what do you think a virtue ethicist approach to war and pacifism would be? Have a think. Write an answer in, Josh or Mike. Josh or Ben, sir. And I'm going to consume some more Wensleydale. Come on, just looking for answers. No, I can't think of anything. Still typing. War and pacifism. Any thoughts? I'm assuming you've done your booklet on war and pacifism and done the practice questions. Haha. I might be checking in September. If you weren't in school, Ben, that's an interesting point. You weren't in school, were you? I have been giving out booklets to support stuff. I probably could have, if you're missing any of the development booklets, do. I'm in school next week, Wednesday, Thursday, and possibly Monday. Come and find me and get some. All right, let's move on then. So what would a pacifist say about war? So again, there's two sides to this. War, you can't imagine, remember, virtue ethics is all about not just the individual, but the society, the community. You can't reach eudaimonia unless your society is reaching eudaimonia. And certainly on a list of virtues that would be Athenian, at least, and I use that word specifically, you would say war may not be part of it, and a eudaimonia Athenian type civilization. However, it may be possible to go to war in order to achieve that as a goal. As you know, maybe you can't avoid that. Maybe you want a society with those things, but you need, and it's a sort of just war theory kind of thing here, which would be part of the goal of a certain type of eudaimonia. And maybe you just have to embrace a different set of virtues, the Homeric virtues of the warrior, the adventurer, of the Odyssey and the Iliad. So virtue ethics focuses on character. We can argue that soldiers need to have certain virtues. My daughter has joined the officers training corps, something like that. And they are all about developing courage and bravery and sense of justice, standing up for the poor and the weak, as virtues. Meanwhile, they have to run around the field and stab things at 6 a.m, it seems. So these are the virtues of Homer. Now, the realities of being a soldier are, all of that's a bit idealistic. The reality is you don't develop so much, you develop compliance, actually, don't you? You just follow orders. And one wonders if that sort of obedience and compliance is an example of prudence, of pronesis, or of wisdom. In fact, that sort of wisdom is discouraged in the army. One of the Stoic cardinal virtues, they weren't called cardinal virtues by the Stoics, but Aristotle called them so. No, you don't exercise your own wisdom, you just follow orders. So it does make you think, can a soldier be a virtuous individual? Now, remember, Aquinas talks about just in bellum, justice in the approach to war, and then just ad bellum, just in bellum, just ad bellum. So justice during war. Well, as you go towards war, virtue ethics would be concerned, for example, with the training of soldiers and how it affects them. I haven't been to many, haven't been trained as a soldier myself, and my daughter has, and I can't imagine at any point they've trained them in the theological or revealed virtue ethics of faith, hope, and love. It's not something you get by your drill sergeant. No, you are taught to kill, to hate, to indiscriminately stab. My daughter came back and described how they made her practice stab this, and until it became habituated. So what's going on then? If virtue ethics has something very interesting to say here about the training of soldiers, if you behave in a certain way, you develop that trait. And the virtue ethics would say that the approach to war will train soldiers to hate and to kill. That has to be figured into things. And they will continue to behave that way. You can't just switch off. If you go to war and you learn certain hate, certain practice certain things. That won't go away when you come home. There's a lot of talk of PTSD, people who come back from war and they're in shock. What there's not a lot of talk of is people who come back from war and relive it and want to and are excited by it. I think of the film Rambo. In the first Rambo film, First Blood. Come on, it's classic stuff, guys. You got to watch it. A soldier returning to Vietnam starts killing people one by one. Yeah, think about the Iraq War. Now, it's a few years ago now, but in northern Iraq, the Americans had a prison called Abu Ghraib, and it became infamous for the horrendous way they treated Iraqi Muslim prisoners and the degrading and form of torture that was used, waterboarding and taking all their clothes off and all sorts of stuff. So soldiers are trained to hate. So is any surprise that what they did? So that's war and pacifism. Okay, issue number 3. We've done environmental ethics, war and pacifism. Sexual ethics. So hopefully you've done a bit of sexual ethics. I gave a booklet out and you had a couple of practice questions to do on this. Go for a type. Go to the chat. Let me just check in the chat. Just back on. Before we do that one, Ben says, "Is it a virtue to be forgiving and not escalate tit for tatty?" It seems to me, Ben, just on that notion of forgiveness. Is that what your drill sergeant would teach you, or is that more what a theological virtue? That is one of the extended, you think about the list of religious virtues, not just faith, hope, and love in 1 Corinthians 13:13, but the longer list you get from Paul in Ephesians 5, faith, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. I think forgiveness is in there, and so on. So that seems to be a revealed virtue, not one that comes naturally, as it were. While forgiving is too much, you will be walked over. Yes, and certainly the Homeric perception of virtue would see it as a form of cowardice, perhaps. Is there can you be half forgiving? Is there a mean to forgiveness, as it were? Is forgiveness a virtue, or is it a vice? It's one of those things that doesn't fit normally. It doesn't fit into Aristotle's way of thinking. And you're right, but if you don't forgive enough, you'll escalate all-out war. So maybe it's part of intellectual virtue to think through things and weigh up intellectually. I've got some kids arriving in my house in a minute, by the way, boys. So it might be just a little bit noisy, but hopefully, if I have to move, I'll move. And Josh says the war is sometimes necessary in order to be virtuous. Yeah, absolutely. So sexual ethics. Any thoughts on that one? What would a virtue ethicist argue in terms of sexual ethics? Remember we looked at adultery out of contraception, same-sex marriage. These are the sort of issues. What would Aristotle say about same-sex marriage and so on? Okay, it's difficult to chat, but I'll look at your comments in a minute. Okay, we'll crack on. So in terms of a virtue ethicist approach to sexual ethics, virtue theory of Aristotle, at least, focuses on the theory of causation. Remember the 4 causes and the final cause, the material, the efficient, the formal, and the final cause, or purpose, is what gives a thing its shape, and the way it should be. Now, that's a sort of essentialist or a view of nature many people would reject today. So how should we act to be useful and potent in society? If you want to be useful, you've got to act in the right function or the right useful way to be effective. Maybe some people are acting in the right way and some people are acting in the wrong way, if there is a right and a wrong way. So let's take masturbation. What is the teleos? We do not look to our teleos in the same way in which natural law would. You're not thinking that, you just aren't. It's certainly from, as you go to Aquinas, it's an unnatural, it's against God's will and our purpose. It's against the natural use of the genitalia. Aquinas is pretty much down on it. The person who masturbates is likely to become sexually frustrated, therefore may leap into a relationship with someone before marriage when they're not ready or not committed to this relationship, or might lead to uncontrolled desire or rape. So, arguments for or against that in particular. Someone who does it too frequently may not lead a normal life. Is there a moderate way you might do, a middle way, as it were, or pursue relation because this contributes negatively to society or doesn't contribute at all? We haven't got time to look at pornography, but that could be an issue as well here. If we look to the virtue theory as a golden mean, one may use it to fulfill one's sexual needs when you're not in a relationship. However, it shouldn't be used as a substitute for seeking of a committed, fulfilling, childbearing relationship. And certainly the Catholic understanding, that's the view. But one wonders what Aristotle's view is. It's hard to understand this issue outside of the lens of the Catholic way of thinking. And that includes the modern virtue ethicist Anscombe. Now, Anscombe was a Catholic, and she sees links between natural moral law and virtue ethics very clearly. She held to very traditional views on marriage and same-sex, and basically accepted what Aquinas said. Those who try to make room for sex or mere casual enjoyment pay the penalty. They become shallow. At any rate, they talk that reflects and commends this attitude is always shallow. They dishonor their own bodies. Look at that. They dishonor their own bodies, as if there's a way of honoring and dishonoring, a right way and a wrong way, a natural use of the genitalia, holding cheap what is naturally connected with the origination of human life. So, certainly Aquinas has had a big influence on the virtue ethic approach to sexual ethics. Aristotle less so. You may know that pedestry and all kinds of other sexual practices were pretty much normal in Greece. It's not clear that Aristotle felt the same as Aquinas or even Anscombe. When it comes to homosexuality, thus the parallels between natural moral law and virtue theory become really evident because they're kind of linked. Both natural moral law and virtue ethics have their origins in Aristotle and the idea of the teleos. There's a goal, a teleos, a purpose for human beings. But this, while it may seem to suggest there's a sort of conservative line to be taken by virtue ethicists on homosexuality, isn't necessarily the case. If a person is same-sex attracted, they may not want to have children. And taking this into account, it seems that both theories would prefer here for a relationship between two men or two women to be allowed, as this way the couples can play a role in society which is structured and similar to straight couples. Although NML views reproduction as the purpose, this is not going to be fulfilled under any circumstance, then it's surely less evil to fulfill the primary precepts of achieving an ordered society than to condemn same-sex attracted people or outlaw them or try to change them. So, sexual ethics. Let's just go back to the chat and see if you've got any questions on this. Just do 2 calls. Just now. Okay, no more questions. We'll crack on then. Okay, issue, so we look at environmental ethics, sexual ethics, war and pacifism, and now equality. So again, looking back as revision on this year, you should be able to go back and look at our issues on sexism, racism, and attitudes to disability. And then you should have the sort of booklets and some essays on this. So what would a virtue ethicist argue on equality? Now, this is a rarefied field. Aristotle, of all people, cannot be held up as a paragon of equal rights, given his whole his emphasis on the beautiful gentleman was really quite sexist, chauvinist, and the background is he never criticized slavery. He never criticized, not quite racism, but ethnocentrism. Racism is a modern word. We learned that. And so I wouldn't go to Aristotle to look for any, just equal rights. You're not going to find it there. You just won't. Now, equal rights does begin to emerge with Aquinas. Now, I've made a mistake on the slide there. That should say, there we go. And I just changed that. That should say Aquinas' emphasis. Aquinas' emphasis. Because that just annoyed me. Aquinas' emphasis on natural equality. Look at these phrases: natural liberty of all human beings. Doesn't sound very Greek. Doesn't sound very Aristotle. It's a change. It's a difference. Now, and it flows out of his idea of the four laws. Remember this idea of natural moral law? The eternal, the divine, the human, and then the natural and the human laws. And this suggests there is such a thing as natural rights. He uses he talks in Latin, of course, the idea of just naturally. My Latin is terrible. Not about as good as my Greek and all the other languages I have to kind of dabble in. Just naturally. It just means that there's a natural justice. There are natural rights, which means equality. Well, if he's not getting equality from Aristotle, where's he really getting it from? Well, remember Aquinas is doing a kind of synthesis of Greek and kind of Hebrew / Christian, Judeo-Christian ideas. He's getting it from his use of scripture. Aquinas wrote many commentaries on scripture. He was adept at reading and commenting on the Bible. He would have known of Galatians 3:28. There's neither slave nor free, male nor female, Jew nor Greek. You're all, key phrase, one in Christ. And in the end, Aquinas is very, well, if he is muted on slavery and equality in marriage, he's in the Middle Ages. This is the Dark Ages, I'll let you decide. But actually, it's a step forward in terms of equality. No, if we want a virtue ethical approach to equality, we have to go right away up to the modern age. Elizabeth Anscombe, in her 1958 essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, when she critiqued deontology and utilitarianism as lacking an ethics of community, she's the one who argues virtue ethics is better, more moral, because it is more feminine, less rationalistic than Kantian duty-based theory, natural moral law. Its emphasis on developing virtue is important. These are the virtues for communal relationships. And it emphasizes community over individual rationality and the virtues you need for living in community. Now, it has to be said, Aristotle had said that. This is not something Aristotle hadn't said. But for Aristotle, it would have been the virtues the beautiful gentleman needs to live in community with other beautiful gentlemen, not to live in community with women and with especially people who weren't Greek from those awful other tribes. I don't know. the Romans or the barbarians or whatever. Philippa Foot, likewise, also 20 years later, as another named scholar, in her asked this question: why be moral? Why be just? Why be temperate? And all the other virtues. And argues for a natural goodness that we should take seriously, that's just embedded in human nature. And the way she emphasizes emotion and desire is a very feminine emphasis. Her idea of avoiding thin ethical concepts for thick ethical concepts in her book, Verses and Virtues, again brings to mind a holistic view of the person, and the person in context as a relational being, in the context of, again, which is a very feminine theory of ethics as opposed. So on the issues of equality, racism, approach to disability, Anscombe and Foot would have much more to say. There we go. Right. How are we doing? Just checking the chat. Anybody got any questions on our 4 issues so far before we do our last issue? So environmental ethics, sexual ethics, war and pacifism, equality. All right, we're all good. Okay, let's do the last one. I could ask you if you had a microphone and if you were a good type, but there we go. What would a virtue ethicist... Now, we haven't done this topic yet. I realize that. And this is a big topic. Next year, it's both an anthology piece, and in the last unit 6.2, I think it is, we do medical ethics. Now, you'll remember this. You know what euthanasia is. I'm sure you did it in secondary school at some point, perhaps GCSE, short or full course. We would have done it. So what is euthanasia? You know what this is. Anybody want to remind me what euthanasia is? It's an easy question. Go on, type it in. What's euthanasia? Quick definition. Tell me you're still alive. Type it in. Go on, type it in. What is euthanasia? Anyone there? Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Euthanasia is... No. Okay. Well, let's move on. All right. Okay, euthanasia, I'm sure you know this. I'm sure you know that euthanasia is means gentle or easy death. We normally think of what's called voluntary active euthanasia. When you want someone to give you a drug, here's barbiturates, it's one of the drugs they give people on death row. If you want someone to help you die because you're in great pain, you're suffering, or so on. That's the general definition. And then we can divide it, and we'll do this next year, into passive and active, voluntary and non-voluntary, and the different attitudes that people have to those different types. What do virtue ethicists say about this? So, well, Aristotle believed we should aim for the individual and social life of eudaimonia, happiness. A sort of happiness that results in a life of perfect balance. Well, and there's lots we can say here. Eudaimonia means we develop the habits of patience and temperance and courage. And these virtues are perfected in order not just for ourselves, but to help others, benefit others. People suffering, well, we can run this both ways. People suffering greatly from illness, you could argue, aren't living the eudaimonial life. They're not living a balanced life. If there's a way to improve their well-being, certainly Aristotle would support the idea of the hospice movement and pain relief and all of that. But does that include the voluntary euthanasia society or dignity and death's solution of sending you off to Dignitas in Switzerland for a swift way out? Maybe you can learn virtue as you suffer. Certainly that would be a Christian response, the Catholic response. You embrace suffering and you develop virtue. Maybe for the well-being of other people, the ordering of society, it would be a bad idea for you to look for euthanasia. So if someone is incurably and terminally ill, Aristotle might hope that they would have the courage to accept their fortune and learn in it, develop virtue in it. It isn't quite clear if he would expect someone to have patience to cope with their condition or the courage to end their own life. He would say that a person achieving eudaimonia would have the wisdom and judgment to make the right decision, perhaps on their own. And remember, Greek society practiced euthanasia and practiced abortion, such that doctors had to take what was called the Hippocratic Oath. That's the origin. It's in Greek society, Hippocrates. So it's not clear exactly what Aristotle's view would be. He seems to leave it over to us to make our own autonomous choice. Do we want the hospice or do we need dignitas? Aristotle was concerned with the good for society above the individual, eudaimonia society. And where culture's resources are scarce, you could argue euthanasia might make a huge difference. Certainly the Nazis argued that. Come on, Gran, you've had your space. We need you. You're slowing the economy down. Very Nazi argument. You could also argue if you legalize euthanasia, that will lead to a terrifying Nazi-like society. So maybe it isn't a good thing. So you can argue both sides. Under these circumstances, it may be the courageous, noble act to accept your fate and let Dr. Mengele take your life. Or maybe the courageous, noble act is to resist that and to protect the rights of the innocents. In our society, people are living longer and longer. So these are pressing concerns. People are surviving when they wouldn't have. There's a loss, huge loss of financial benefits to your generation. Us boomers, I'm not quite a boomer, but assume I am, might have spent all of your future, as it were. Maybe we deserve to be euthanized. I don't know. So, however, it doesn't keep in keeping with Aristotle's virtues, patience, modesty, temperance, and so on. So you can argue both sides on this. We come to the modern virtue ethicist MacIntyre. He is a relativist virtue ethicist. He keeps talking about tradition. What tradition are you in? What is your society? What would say? And he would argue Britain is moving towards a change in the law regarding euthanasia. We haven't had the Rubicon moment of voluntary euthanasia being legalized, but we're getting very close. In America, there have been some states that legalized euthanasia, and yet America imprisoned Jack Kevorkian, who helped over 100 people die. And that raised a huge debate. If you watch the film, You Don't Know Jack. MacIntyre might explain why other countries, particularly Roman Catholic countries and Muslim countries, are likely to resist any weakening of the law regarding the ending of human life. But he himself doesn't kind of want to get drawn into making arguments. Can we make arguments, though, from MacIntyre, even if he himself will not really want to commit to saying whether euthanasia is right or wrong? With Aristotle, he just wants to make a decision that you make in terms of your context, the tradition, the society you're from, i.e. Britain. But that doesn't help us. MacIntyre is interested in the rise of modern metaphysics, the metaphysics of efficiency. We're left only with efficiency and effectiveness of actions, the two great moral principles of modernity. That sounds a bit Nazi to me. You might argue voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide should not be legalized because too much that is important about living and dying will be lost if we do so. Too much for our society. So we can use MacIntyre both ways to argue that we need to keep it illegal because it gives us the opportunity to develop virtue. Or maybe if our tradition changes, then our virtues must change as well, and we must allow a change in the law. Right, how have we done today? We're just about there. Our 5 issues. You should be able to use one of those, at least maybe 2 of those, in an essay on virtue ethics. Like I say, it was a 30-mark essay. The strengths and weaknesses. Virtue. You apply it critically. Referring to scholars Got to keep learning your scholars, got to keep learning your quotes, got to keep learning your vocabulary. Right. I wanted to play Let's Make Links, and I'd hope we could write in this box here between scholars and issues. One sentence. Maybe you can still do that in the chat. Can you write one sentence from what you've learned today about any of these scholars and what they say about any of these issues? Just pick one. So each of you, can you now write one sentence? I was hoping we could do this on the screen, and I didn't do a lesson end. Just trying a new thing. But anyway, write it in the chat and see what you say. So I want you to say, Aristotle would say about X, that X, okay? Because you've got to learn to use scholars and apply it to issues. Okay, so I'm waiting for you to write a sentence. See what you write. So one scholar, one issue. What have you learned today? Being very quiet. We are there. Good. Josh says they might argue, Aristotle believed that war was done with the correct teleos, then it could be acceptable. Yes. Maybe you're aiming to, like, it's a just war sort of thing where you're aiming for you want to build the Athenian society, but to get to the Athenian society, you've got to use the Homeric virtues of bravery and courage and so on. Excellent. Really good. Josh, anything from Mr. Paris? I'll give you a minute. Okay, well, I'll just check again in a second, Ben, if you write anything. Let's just bring this into land then today. Okay, so what sort of things could we say? Well, just keep reminding you about this. Next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, you're still in school next week. That's the decision we've had. I want to do 2 more live lessons. I'm actually going to look at, you should be working on your anthology work. I'm be uploading more videos, but in particular, next week's lesson, I'm actually going to do 30 minutes or 1 hour. I'm going to focus on the 2 passages that I'm asking you to write a 10 and 20 mark on. They have to be done. I prefer them in before the summer than the end of the summer. But I won't be going over them again in September, so you need to make sure that they're done. Okay, let's finish off today. So what, in summary, could we say? Well, Aristotle had lots to say, particularly about war and pacifism, and Josh had some nice comments to make there. Sexual ethics, yeah, well, at least a bit more complex. Did Aristotle have much to say about homosexuality or not? Certainly Aquinas did. And Aristotle certainly had a lot less to say about equality and environmental ethics. He was at least a shallow ecologist, with the hierarchy of being that people like Lynn White and others criticize strongly. Aquinas, well, he had lots to say about sexual ethics, natural moral law, the primary precepts, secondary principles. Euthanasia, I think the first primary precept, to preserve life, that seems to be wrong on that count. Aquinas is more muted on equality, although he does seem to say certain things. And war and pacifism, again, less to say on those sort of things. Anscombe has much to say about the failure, actually, of Aquinas in certain areas, but particularly Kant and utilitarianism. Argues for more feminist intrapersonal virtue, so is interested in equality for women and an ethics that works for women in particular. Philippa Foot developed that sort of pragmatic form of ethics that talks about the worthy use of virtues. And if you're not using what virtue you have in a worthy way, then it ceases to be virtue. Think in terms of someone like Hitler. The wise do both what is intrinsically and extrinsically good. And it's more moral to struggle to overcome temptation. That is a conscious, continual intention. But it's not clear what her view is on the application of this to something like euthanasia. Is euthanasia a worthy use of your virtues, or is it a ceasing to be virtue? Without her attempt at a sort of cognitivist form of religious ethical language isn't in the end clear on this. Finally, McIntyre is perhaps sitting on the fence on a whole range of issues here. You can use McIntyre to support euthanasia, to challenge euthanasia. He sits on either side of the fence on it in a way. He just says, what's your tradition? You should, but that doesn't help us in terms of a democratic society. He just lets things run democratically. But that leads us down a dark path, I think, in the end. There's lots of extra readings and stuff you can do in terms of this bit of the course. And I have now updated the website. Have a look at this. This is the page on virtue ethics. You should have this workbook that you should be trundling your way through. Yeah, there it is. You've got all of that. And there is some practice questions at the back on that. That's as well as your anthology. The lesson videos have been uploaded. You can watch these. There are some further notes. And we haven't got to Kantian ethics. That's what's coming up in September. I've also put up on this particular site some extra videos now. Just let them load. Sorry, there you go. From 4 videos from this guy here, properly produced videos from Luke Pollard. Again, support videos to help you on virtue ethics. Now, that is the end of today's lesson, but happy to take any questions.